Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a really hard look at one of the darkest chapters in American judicial history. It's a profoundly tragic story. It centers on George Stinney Jr., an African-American boy who holds the heartbreaking distinction of being the youngest person ever executed in U.S. history. He was just 14. Our mission today, really drawing directly from the sources you've shared, is to try and unpack the layers of injustice, the racial prejudice, and frankly, the profound procedural failures that led to his wrongful conviction and execution back in 1944. It's a powerful story, deeply disturbing, but I think it offers some crucial insights.
Absolutely. And this case, it isn't just something dusty from the past. It's almost like a chilling blueprint for how systemic bias can completely warp justice. It really reveals that the very systems designed for fairness, they can become tools of oppression if they're not challenged. And that echoes, it really does, impacting how we view justice even now.
Right. So to really get this, we need to go back. South Carolina, 1944. What was it actually like for a young black boy growing up there then? What was the social landscape?
You have to imagine a world just defined by pervasive racial segregation. It was deeply entrenched by what they called Jim Crow laws. And this wasn't just like social custom, it was the actual law. Black and white communities were kept strictly separate.
So separate schools, separate transport?
Exactly. Black kids couldn't go to white schools. On a bus, black people legally had to give up their seat to a white passenger, move to the back. Even places like courthouses, churches segregated. Almost no interaction allowed. If you didn't comply, well, you could be removed, even arrested. It was that rigid.
That paints a really stark picture of division. And what was the thinking behind all that? The ideology?
Well, it's fascinating in a grim way how deliberate it all was. This was a time when former Confederate soldiers, their supporters, were actively working to resist any move towards equality after the Civil War. Their stated aim was to, quote, regain white dignity. They pushed this belief that white people were the true Americans. And this wasn't just talk. This systematic oppression was written into law in many southern states, specifically designed to suppress black rights and freedoms.
And into this world, this deeply divided world, George Stinney Jr. and his family lived. Can you give us a sense of their life in Alcolu?
Yeah, they were described as a close-knit African-American family. Living in Alcolu, South Carolina, their neighborhood was literally physically separated from the white areas by railroad tracks. George himself, born October 21st, 1929. His parents were George Sr. and Ames Stinney. He had siblings, an older brother, John, 17, a younger brother, Charles, 12, and two younger sisters, Catherine, 10, and Aim, who was just 7. George was seen as, a responsible kid, helped his parents, looked after his little sisters. One of his regular chores was taking the family cow out to graze. Sounds like a pretty simple, quiet life.
A simple life, yes, but one that was just tragically shattered on March 23, 1944.
Right.
What happened? What set these events in motion?
That morning, the bodies of 2 young white girls were found. 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Timms. They were found in a ditch, importantly, within the black section of Alcolu. The autopsy showed severe blunt force trauma, basically. Their heads and faces had been crushed, causing skull fractures. The weapon was thought to be something heavy and hard, like maybe a piece of metal, a railroad spike, or tie. Crucially, there were no signs of sexual assault. Betty June did have some minor bruising, but the police at the time just dismissed it as unrelated.
And how did George Stinney Jr., this 14-year-old boy, get caught up in this horrific discovery?
Well, the day before the bodies were found, George and his little sister, 7-year-old Aim, they were out grazing the family cow, just like usual. They happened to run into Betty June and Mary Emma. The girls asked them if they knew where to find maypop flowers, passion flowers. Later, when the police were investigating, George, trying to be helpful, told them about this brief encounter. He thought it might help them find who did it. He had young sisters himself. He just wanted to help.
Okay, and here's where things take a really sharp, disturbing turn, right? What happened immediately after he shared that?
What happened next was, it was immediate and frankly shocking. Within just one day of the bodies being found, March 24th, 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was arrested. He was named the prime suspect. And remember his size, just 5'1", maybe 95 pounds, tiny? Yet the sheriff announced very quickly to the whole community that George had confessed. Not only confessed, but that he led them to the murder weapon, supposedly a 15-inch iron rod, hidden near the victims' bicycles.
And the reason for arresting him so quickly, what was their rationale?
The rationale seems chillingly simple and based entirely on race. Because George was black and because he admitted he'd seen the girls, the police just assumed he was guilty. They decided he must be the one. His older brother, John, he was also arrested initially, but John had a solid alibi, so they had to release him. George wasn't so fortunate.
And the interrogation he went through sounds just awful. Can you describe that?
It was horrific by any standard, especially for a child. He was questioned for about 2 hours. No parents present, no lawyer, no contact with his family at all. He was apparently terrified, crying, asking repeatedly to see his mother, asking to go home. The police, it seems, used his fear against him. They reportedly promised him, just confess and we'll let you go home. Under that kind of pressure, completely overwhelmed, confused, scared, he just started saying, yes, sir, to whatever they asked, leading questions like, did you kill them? Yes, sir. Did you hit them with the iron rod? Yes, sir. He just wanted it to stop. He wanted to go home.
And it's worth mentioning, there were some other allegations floating around about him from before, weren't there? Though they were disputed.
Yes, that's right. Some white residents, even a teacher apparently, claims, said George had been in fights at school. One incident supposedly involved a knife and a girl. Another white girl claimed he threatened her. But George's family strongly denied all of this. They insisted he was a good, responsible boy, taught to look after his siblings. They said these stories just weren't true. But back then, it seems nobody really listened to the family side.
What followed that arrest and interrogation was just a blur of injustice. He was brought to trial almost instantly. The whole thing, jury selection, the trial itself, the verdict, it all happened in a single day.
One day. Which immediately raises, serious questions about the legal help George got. His court-appointed lawyer was a man named Charles Plowden. Now, it's been suggested quite strongly that Plowden was maybe more focused on his own local political campaign at the time. He wanted the case over quickly, perhaps. His defense strategy was, incredibly weak. He claimed George acted in self-defense, said the girls attacked him after he tried to help one who fell in the ditch, and he killed them to stop them from telling anyone. It barely made sense.
And how did that flimsy story stack up against what the prosecution was saying?
Well, it was completely overshadowed. The prosecution relied heavily on the sheriff's account, the supposed confession. They pushed the narrative that George followed the girls to molest them, killed Mary Emma when they resisted, then killed Betty June. They brought 6 witnesses, 3 police officers, the priest, Francis Bechon, who actually found the bodies, and 2 doctors. The doctors discussed the possibility of sexual assault, pointing to that minor bruising on Betty June. Contrast that with the defense. Plowden called 0 witnesses. He barely cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses. The entire trial, testimony and all, lasted just 2.5 hours.
2.5 hours to decide a child's life. The scene in the courtroom itself must have been intimidating.
Intimidating is an understatement. Reports say over 1,000 white spectators crammed into the courtroom, eager for a verdict. But no black people were allowed inside. Not one. The judge was white. The jury, all white men. All the lawyers, white. So you have George, this terrified 14-year-old black kid, utterly alone, not a single friendly or even neutral face among the people holding his life in their hands. His own family was barred. They couldn't even be there.
And the verdict went again.
It was terrifyingly fast. The jury was out for only 10 minutes. They came back with a guilty verdict. Judge Philip H. Stoll immediately sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death by electric chair. Unanimous decision. And in what seemed like a final shocking piece of negligence, his lawyer, Plowden, filed no appeal. None.
After this incredibly swift conviction and sentence, were there any attempts to, intervene, to save him?
Yes, there were desperate attempts. George's family, along with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had been fighting for black civil rights since 1909, they pleaded with the governor, Olin D. Johnston. They begged for clemency, pointing out George's age. He was just a child. But the governor flatly refused. And worse, he actually spread these horrific, completely false stories. Claimed George killed the younger girl to rape her, then raped her corpse, then came back 20 minutes later to do it again. This was despite multiple autopsy reports clearly stating there was no sexual assault. It was just vile.
And the cruelty extended even to his family during his imprisonment.
It did. His parents were mostly denied visits. They were allowed only one very brief meeting with him while he was in the Sumter County Jail. The official reason given was to protect the family from lynching, which sounds protective, but it also highlights the terrifying reality of the time. Lynching, extrajudicial murder by white mobs, often involving torture, hanging, burning, was a brutal tool of racial terror used against black people. Selling postcards of the victims' bodies even happened, so the threat was real, but it also isolated George completely.
And then the execution itself.
Then came the final tragic act, June 16th, 1944, 7:03 p.m. George Stinney Jr. was walked to the electric chair at the South Carolina Central Correctional Institution in Columbia. Because he was so small again, 5'1", 95 pounds, the guards actually struggled to strap him into the adult-sized chair properly. The straps didn't fit. The electrode cap, the part that goes on the head, was way too big. When they sent the first jolt of 2400 volts, the cap actually slipped off his head. They had to stop, refasten it, and then continue the electrocution. He was electrocuted for a total of 4 minutes.
It's just hard to comprehend the speed of it all.
It really is. From the moment those poor girls' bodies were found to the moment George Stinney Jr. was executed. Only 83 days passed? 83 days. For a 14-year-old boy to be arrested, railroaded through a trial, convicted, and killed by the state. It's an astonishingly short time frame for such a catastrophic failure of justice.
So the story seemingly ends there, in tragedy. But then, decades later, things started to shift. We jump forward to 2004.
Yes. Decades later, a local historian from Aukalu, George Frierson, happened to read an old newspaper article about the case. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He became convinced Stinney was innocent and started digging. Really digging. He began a serious investigation.
And what did his investigation involve? How did he pursue this?
He was incredibly determined. He teamed up with lawyers and also the Civil Rights and Justice Project, the CRJP, from Northeastern Law School's branch in South Carolina. They worked together, meticulously combing through historical records, gathering evidence, finding details that had been overlooked or perhaps deliberately ignored back in 1944. Finally, in October 2013, they filed a formal motion to reopen George Stinney Jr.'s case.
And when they got back into court, what was the new evidence they presented? What did they uncover?
It was compelling. Several key things emerged. First, they had an affidavit from Father Francis Bachon, the priest who originally found the girls' bodies. He stated there was actually very little blood at the scene where the bodies were discovered.
Which
strongly suggested the girls weren't killed there. It pointed to the possibility they were killed somewhere else, and their bodies were moved, dumped in the ditch in the black neighborhood, perhaps specifically to frame someone black.
What else came to light? Anything about the physical aspects?
Yes, the sheer physical impossibility. They re-emphasized George's size, 5'1", 95 pounds. Betty June, the older girl, was 11, likely of a similar size or even bigger. Could he realistically have overpowered two girls and then carry or drag both bodies a significant distance from where he saw them to that ditch? And logically, as was pointed out, if he'd attacked one girl, wouldn't the other one have run screaming for help? It just didn't add up physically.
Were there other key testimonies?
Absolutely. Third, and this was crucial, was the testimony of George's sister, Aim. She was 7 at the time, remember? She had always maintained consistently that George was with her the whole time they were grazing the cow, that they only spoke to the girls very briefly. Her testimony was completely dismissed back in 1944. They said she was too young, biased, unreliable. But now, her consistent account was finally given weight. And one more thing, testimony from a former cellmate, Wilford Johnny Hunter. He served time with George briefly and claimed George told him the police had forced him to confess, that they wouldn't let him see his parents until he did.
Wow. So this collection of new evidence, it led to a really significant moment.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
On December 16th, 2014, 70 years later, Judge Carmen Mullen issued a landmark ruling. She officially vacated George Stinney Jr.'s conviction, declared him innocent in the eyes of the law. Her ruling specifically cited a profound lack of due process. Basically, he was denied the fundamental fairness and legal protections everyone is supposed to have. She pointed to the flagrantly ineffective legal representation, and she stated unequivocally that executing a 14-year-old constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The system finally admitted its terrible mistake.
It is important, though, to acknowledge the reaction from the victims' families. They didn't necessarily see it that way.
No, and that adds another layer of tragedy. Some members of the Binnicker and Thames families remained adamant that George was guilty. They felt the exoneration was wrong, that the original verdict was correct. It really underscores the deep, lasting pain and complexity surrounding the case for everyone involved.
And in the years since, has there been any stronger indication of who the real killer might have been?
There's a leading theory, though it remains unproven legally. It centers on a man named George Burke Jr. He was the son of a prominent, wealthy white businessman in the area, George Burke Sr. Now, here's a deeply troubling connection. George Burke Sr., the father, was not only part of the volunteer search party for the girls, he was also the foreman of the jury that convicted George Stinney.
The jury foreman.
The jury foreman, which immediately raises the suggestion that he might have used his influence to steer the verdict, possibly to protect his own son. There was even a claim, later recanted by Burke Jr.'s own son, that his father confessed to the murders on his deathbed. Again, that remains unconfirmed.
So after all that, 70 years of being labeled a murderer.
Exactly. For 7 long decades, George Stinney Jr.'s name was synonymous with child murder. All because he was a black child in the wrong place at the wrong time in a society built on deep systemic racism. His exoneration was vital, but incredibly late.
To really feel the personal impact, let's circle back to Aim, George's little sister, the one who was with him that day. What became of her?
Her story is just heartbreaking. She was 77 years old in 2014 when her brother was finally cleared. She spoke about her last memory of George seeing him taken away in these 2 black cars. He told her to run, tell their other siblings, John and Catherine. The next time she saw him, he was in his coffin. She remembered his face being visibly burned from the electrocution. After George's arrest and execution, her father lost his job. The family was basically run out of town. Aim said she never went back to Alcaloo. Never. She called it a cursed place because of what the state did to her family.
Just devastating.
Yeah.
So looking at the bigger picture, what are the enduring lessons or implications from George Stinney Jr.'s case?
It's such a stark, powerful reminder of how easily deep-seated racial bias and the abuse of power can corrupt the justice system. It's not just an abstract idea. It has devastating, real-world consequences that ripple through generations. It shows the terrible impact these injustices have, not just on the person wrongly accused, but on their entire family, their community. And it underscores why we constantly need to be vigilant against these kinds of systemic failures.
And you mentioned earlier, this isn't just history. It connects to things still happening today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Sadly, yes. You can draw a line, unfortunately, from cases like George Stinney Jr.'s to more recent tragedies involving racial injustice and police brutality. The source material mentions George Floyd, whose death in 2020 sparked global protests. These events highlight the ongoing struggle for truly equal rights, equal treatment under the law. They show why movements like Black Lives Matter continue to be so necessary, demanding justice and accountability.
There is now at least a headstone for George in South Carolina. It bears an inscription finally clearing his name. It says, George Stinney Jr. was unjustly judged by the law of South Carolina, but he's now exonerated by order of the court. A small symbolic measure of justice. So we've just walked through this incredibly difficult story, from the initial crime, the rushed and biased trial, the horrifyingly swift execution, and then finally 70 years later, the exoneration. It really exposes the cracks when prejudice gets into the system.
It truly does. Stinney's story isn't just something to know about, it's a vital lesson. It screams out the critical importance of due process, of real, robust legal protections for everyone, regardless of race or age. And it underscores the ongoing, absolutely essential fight against racial injustice and any form of cruel, inhumane punishment. It really forces us to examine power and prejudice within our legal frameworks.
Which leaves us with a heavy question to reflect on. What does George Stinney Jr.'s story mean for how we understand justice, not just in the past, but right here in our world today? Something to think about. We hope this deep dive has offered you some perspective, maybe some moments of clarity on this incredibly important case. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning.